Well, good afternoon. My name is Catherine Champagne, pronounced Champagne if you're in Acadiana, and I am pleased to be moderating today's webinar. As an overview of the webinar series, the goal is to provide non-biased, research-based information about childhood obesity. These webinars are produced by Pennington Biomedical Research Center and co-hosted and co-branded by the Louisiana Department of Education. Today's talks will focus on defining and evaluating childhood obesity and discussing population trends, reviewing physical activity and developmental health in children, and explaining how obesity may be a result of food insecurity. The second in the series, tentatively planned for September, will address childhood obesity in medical and non-medical settings, along with promoting childhood physical activity through the use of technology. For today's webinar, we had more than 265 people registered, mostly from Louisiana, but also from Arkansas, Arizona, Missouri, Texas, North Carolina, Georgia, California, Ohio, Minnesota, and internationally from Australia and Spain. We are indeed pleased about the response. So by way of introduction, our first speaker is Dr. Peter Kaczmarzyk, who is a professor and associate executive director for population and public health sciences at the Pennington Biomedical Research Center, where he holds the Marie Idana Corcoran Endowed Chair in Pediatric Obesity and Diabetes. Dr. Kaczmarzyk is an internationally recognized leader in the field of physical activity and obesity, with a special emphasis on pediatrics and ethnic health disparities. He has over 2 decades of experience in conducting large clinical and population-based studies in children and adults. And many years ago, we had the childhood obesity series that Dr. Kaczmarzyk spearheaded. The second speaker is Dr. Leah Robinson, PhD, and she is professor and chair of movement science at the University of Michigan School of Kinesiology, and we all need to move, right? She is director of the Child Movement Activity and Developmental Health Laboratory and a research professor at the Center for Human Growth and Development. At her time at the University of Michigan, she was on the faculty of Auburn University's School of Kinesiology. Dr. Robinson is internationally known for her research in motor skill acquisition, physical activity, and developmental health in preschool and school-aged children. The overarching goal of her research is encouraging children to be physically active and ensure that they enter school healthy, active, and ready to learn. Our third presenter is Dr. Candace Meyers, PhD, and she is the director of the Social Determinants and Health Disparities Laboratory at Pennington Biomedical Research Center. Her research currently focuses on food insecurity as a key social determinant of health and source of health disparities, with a specific focus on its complex relationship with obesity and cardiovascular health. Dr. Meyers also studies the impact of place environment on health disparities and intervention responses using multi-level theories and methodologies. She also has extensive research expertise in spatially modeling geographic disparities in obesity and diabetes prevalence across the United States. So we are going to be, as you can see from the the agenda that is posted, the questions will be held until the end during the panel. So we will have a panel discussion from 3:10 to 3:30 and before adjourning. And we would, all of our participants are muted. So please put your question in the Q&A box, which should be at the bottom of your screen, which looks like a little chat. So without further ado, Dr. Kaczmarzyk is first up.
My name is Peter Kaczmarzyk, and I'm one of the scientists here at the Pennington Biomedical Research Center in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The topic of my presentation today is going to be on childhood obesity, trying to understand the definition, evaluation, and population trends that we've been observing. So as an overview, I'm going to start by defining childhood obesity and presenting how we diagnose this in childhood. Second, we'll move on and discuss some of the population trends that we've been observing, both globally and nationally. And actually, I'll even touch on some data we have from Louisiana. So let's first turn to the definition and diagnosis of pediatric obesity. So many of you have probably heard of the body mass index, or the BMI. And the BMI is essentially an index of our weight over height. And height is measured in meters squared. And we do this to try to eliminate the effects of height and try to understand our weight status relative to global standards or relative to other individuals. Because you can imagine people of different heights, especially in childhood, people of different heights and weights would be very, very different from one another. You know, if you're a 6 foot tall man and 180 pounds, you know, this might be appropriate for your age, for example. But if you are a child who's 4 feet tall and 180 pounds, then you might have some issues with your weight. So essentially, we use the BMI as kind of a standard definition for addressing both adult and childhood obesity. So it's your weight in kilograms over your height in meters squared. And in adults, it's pretty straightforward. You know, once you hit the age of 18 or 19, we would classify you as being overweight if your BMI was between 25 and 30 kilograms per meter squared. And you would have obesity if you had a BMI that was 30 or higher. So this is the same for men and women, and regardless of your ethnicity, really, in the United States, we use this BMI of 30 kilograms per meter squared to identify individuals who have obesity. So fairly straightforward. However, in childhood, it gets a little more complicated. Because as you know, children are growing, and as they grow, they're increasing in their height and their weight, and their height and weight actually increase at different rates, you know, throughout growth and maturation. So in order to try to standardize you know, BMI even further, we use age and sex specific percentiles. So as this table demonstrates, the normal weight range is between the 5th and the 85th percentile. If a child had their BMI for their age and their sex, you know, within that percentile range, they'd be considered normal weight. Overweight would be a BMI at or above the 85th percentile, but not above the 95th. And once a child's weight for their height squared, or their BMI, is above the 95th percentile compared to other children of their age and their sex, they would be considered to have obesity. So again, it's a little more complicated in childhood, where we have to have an estimate of your height, your weight, your age, and your sex. And then we would compare your BMI against these reference data, they're called, or somewhat of a normal population, you know, for example, the population of the United States. So the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, they've done this for us. They've developed these percentiles over the years. These are based on population data from the 1960s, 70s, and the chart on the left is for girls, and the chart on the right is for boys. And this depicts the childhood growth in body mass index from the ages of 2 through 20 years. And you can see that on the bottom of the graph. You see age going across the bottom. And that darker line in the middle of the graph is the 50th percentile, or the median. So you could almost think of that as an average. This is how the average child in the United States would grow in terms of their BMI. And that would be the 50th percentile. Then, of course, you can see here going either above or below that 50th percentile, the 75th, 85th, 90th, 95th, and 97th. And so at any given age, you could plot a child on here based on their age, sex, and BMI, and try to identify whether they were overweight or obese based on that. And so you see near the top of the graph, at the age of 18 years, in order to be classified as having obesity, you may need to have a BMI over 30. But if you go back down the graph, a 7-year-old could be obese with a BMI of 20. So you see, it definitely changes with age. That's why it's important to understand how BMI changes with age and childhood, as we reflect our own children onto these graphs to try to determine their weight status. So luckily, places like CDC have developed these BMI calculators for children and teenagers. So essentially, you can plug in their age in years and months. You can plug in their sex, whether they're a boy or a girl, and additionally, add their height and weight. And when you click calculate on this calculator, here, they give you these results. So I plugged in a child of 7 years old and 2 months. She's a girl. Her height is 48 inches and she weighs 60 pounds. So based on that, her BMI is 18.3. So if she was an adult, she would be in the normal weight range, right? Her BMI is about 18.5. However, because she's 7 years of age, she's at the 89th percentile, and you can see that she falls within that yellow range of the figure, and this would place her in the overweight category. And again, if you were to move forward, that same BMI over here, as an 18-year-old, you would be in the green. So again, that's why it's important to take into consideration both the child's age as well as their BMI, because it does change so dramatically with age. So these kind of calculators are out there to help clinicians classify children into normal weight, overweight, or obese categories. So I've just kind of described that, in general. And here's an example now of a growth chart, again for girls. The overweight here would be between the 85th and the 95th percentile. If a child is above the 95th percentile now, they would be considered obese. And we've added a new category now, more recently. This is the category of severe obesity. And so that's defined as 120% of the 95th percentile. So it's up here somewhere in the graph. So unfortunately now, we have a large number of children in our society that are off the growth charts. They have what is considered severe obesity. And I'll describe that a little bit here when we talk about the prevalence in the population. So this is a common occurrence. Don't step on it, it makes you cry. Aversion to the scale. So with that, let me kind of move in now and talk about some of the population trends in childhood obesity, now that we understand how you define it in children. So this graph is taken from a number of sources going back to the 1960s in the United States. And it describes the trends, the time trends in obesity in children. And so I've plotted different age groups. In blue, you see these are 2 to 5-year-olds. The orangish color is 6 to 11-year-olds. And the teenagers, 12 to 19 years of age, are shown in gray. And that we see going back in time to where they developed the growth curves, actually, we see that about 5% of kids of all these different ages were obese. Now, as you move forward over time, you see this dramatic increase that occurred through the 1980s, the 90s, and the 2000s. And now, on average, we have about 18.5% of the population has obesity. So since the 1960s through to today, the prevalence of childhood obesity has increased from about 5% to 18.5%. And I think you would understand that this is a very dramatic increase in our biology, whereby children's BMIs are increasing at such a substantial rate in such a short period of time. When you consider the evolutionary timescale, that this is definitely cause for concern. And of course, we can also see here that the prevalence of obesity is lower in the 2 to 5-year-olds compared to older children. However, it is still increasing quite substantially over time. So it's also cause for concern. So we mentioned briefly this new term of severe obesity, which is defined as being over 120% of the 95th percentile. So I've now added that to the chart in comparison with the prevalence of obesity in general in children. So this just goes from around 1999 to 2016. And we see here that the prevalence of severe obesity has increased from about 4% to 6%. So while severe obesity is still not as prevalent as generalized obesity, it has increased quite dramatically. Going from 4 to 6% is actually quite a big increase in these few number of years. And of course, we see here in blue the trend that we described in obesity in general. So both obesity and now severe obesity are impacting a significant number of children in the United States. Approximately 18.5% of kids have obesity and 6% have severe obesity. So this is definitely cause for concern. And now when you look nationally at the patterns, the geographic patterns in childhood obesity, we see the map on the left shows kids who are 10 to 17 years of age. And the prevalence of obesity is depicted here in the different colors. And once you get into the yellowish color, these are the states that have the highest prevalence of childhood obesity. And of course, Louisiana, along with Mississippi and Arkansas and others, are right there in the highest group. Now, when you look at the younger kids of 2 to 4 years of age, you see similar patterns here. There's not as much variation across the states. As you see, we don't have the yellow color in there, but we're still at a rather high level down here in the South, as are many other states. So that just shows kind of the geographic extent of the problem. And I pulled this figure off the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation website. I think it's kind of interesting because it shows Louisiana's rank in terms of childhood obesity among all of the states. And it's just a short time trend, from 2016 through 2018 and 19. So the dark black line here that's in bold is for Louisiana. And you see it's gone up a little bit in the last few years, but it's not that dramatic. But what is dramatic is when you compare this dark line to all of the other gray lines, which represent all of the other states, we'll see that Louisiana is definitely near the top And indeed, we're ranked number 6 in the nation right now for childhood obesity. See, all of these other states down here have a lower prevalence than we do. And the prevalence in Louisiana is just over 20%, so higher than the national average. So there's other factors that influence obesity we have to, take into consideration. And this is the prevalence of childhood obesity plotted by level of parental education on the left, and on the right by ethnicity. So the first thing you observe is that there's quite a trend, between prevalence of childhood obesity and parental education. Parents with higher levels of education, their children tend to have lower prevalences of obesity. When we consider race and ethnicity, we see that African Americans and Hispanics typically have higher levels than the white population, and particularly higher than Asian populations in the United States. So we see that these trends we were observing in general need to kind of be broken down by different characteristics to understand where those high-risk populations are, where those populations of greatest need are in terms of weight management. So let's just look globally here for a moment. This figure shows girls on the left-hand side and boys on the right-hand side. And this shows BMI here with a scale going from blue to green to yellow to red. And so this shows that, the United States is in that orange area for both boys and girls, showing that we have among the highest prevalence of a high BMI in the world. And we see, of course, Australia is also high, as some of these other countries that are in red and orange. And other places, for example, Africa, they're still mainly in the kind of the bluish green area. So there's definitely geographic variability in BMI around the world, in both adults and in children. However, it's very much concentrated in some of the higher income countries, such as the United States, Canada, Australia, and others, some of the European areas as well. So let me turn to this figure. I think it's interesting. It's a little hard to follow, but it shows basically changes in height and changes in BMI. And these are standardized for a 19-year-old. For a 19-year-old person, over time, girls are shown in the top 3 panels, and boys are shown in the bottom 3 panels. Each of the arrows represents a different country, and the areas where these countries come from are shown across the top. So let's just take a look at the green one just to show you how this works. So in girls over here in green, on that left-hand side panel, these are Latin American and Caribbean countries. And we see that over time, that height has increased. You see that these are slanting to the right, showing that over time, from 1985 to 2019, there's been an increase in height in these countries. However, they're also pointing upwards, showing that the mean BMI has also increased in those countries. So in general, if you sit back and kind of take a look at this picture in total, you'll see that overall height has been increasing in 19-year-olds around the world, and the BMI has also been increasing. So the question is, has the BMI increased at a faster rate than height has increased to accommodate? And so I just want to focus over here on the right-hand panels here. If you go down to the boys, look at what's happening here. These are sub-Saharan African countries, as well as Asian countries, Oceania countries. And so we see in those areas of the world, there really hasn't been much increase in height. in sub-Saharan Africa, but their BMIs have been increasing. You know, they're still lower than other countries, but they have been increasing. And also in the Oceania region, we see a similar trend that despite not much of an increase in height over time, the BMIs are actually going up very high. And you see these arrows are pointing upwards. So over time, there's been some quite dramatic increases in these countries down in the South Pacific and you know, all the different island chains down there, where these populations have been impacted by the westernization and going through epidemiologic transitions, whereby their BMIs are increasing and they're becoming among the most obese countries in the world. So what is explaining some of this variability in BMI? You know, we understand that at a basic level, it's all about energy balance. And this is from a study that we conducted in over 6,000 children from 12 different countries all around the world. And we examined the association with obesity based on some characteristics such as sleep, television viewing, MVPA. And MVPA is moderate to vigorous physical activity. So that's physical activity. And then we had a healthy and an unhealthy diet pattern. And the way to interpret this is the more these kids were sleeping, the lower their odds of obesity was. And we understand that children who don't have very much sleep, they have a higher risk of obesity. So that tracks pretty well. On the other hand, greater levels of TV viewing are associated with the higher odds of obesity. And finally, there's quite a dramatic decrease in the odds of obesity with moderate to vigorous activity. So kids who are active, you know, at least 60 minutes a day with physical activity, which is what the recommendation is, their odds of having obesity is 50% compared to someone who's not getting that level of physical activity. So again, these behavioral risk factors are definitely associated with obesity. The healthy and the unhealthy diet patterns didn't come through. There was no significantly different odds of obesity based on what kids were eating in this study. But again, this is a study of 9 to 11-year-olds, and it's sometimes difficult to assess their dietary patterns at that age. So I want to wrap up a little bit, taking kind of a macro view of the problem of obesity and where we are today. So this is a figure produced by Shiriki Kumanyika that has been well cited over the years, and I really like it. And if you really start on the right-hand side of the figure, and we see that we have an obesity prevalence, and that obesity prevalence has been increasing. If you take a step back to where it says individual in the blue color here, we see that, of course, obesity prevalence is a result of energy intake and energy expenditure. It's all about energy balance. However, it's much more complex than that, as we understand. If you step back, we now need to overlay the work or school and the home environment on top of these behaviors. And on top of that, we need to now overlay the community and the locality. Things such as public transport and healthcare, sanitation, these sorts of things now are overlaid on top of the school environment, which are overlaid on now the behaviors. Taking another step back to the left, in purple, we see national or regional forces which may impact obesity. Urbanization, transport, social security, all of these things. And finally, going all the way to the left and looking at international factors, of course, we have global development. We have globalization of markets. All of these are now feeding down the line. So this figure really demonstrates the complexity of what we're dealing with when we are trying to solve an issue related to obesity. It doesn't just start at the level of an individual, it actually has much broader impacts than that. And I wanted to put this up as well. This is even more complicated. This is the Foresight map. It's an obesity system map developed in the UK. And it just highlights the complexity. If you look in the middle of this figure, in the darker kind of lines, that's energy balance. That's kind of the core of obesity. People who are in energy balance, they don't gain weight. And as you mess around with energy intake and expenditure, that's when weight gain begins and obesity may develop. And around the outside of that core are all the different factors which may influence your energy balance. For example, this section over here on the right is physical activity and all the components that go into that. The section down below in the middle of the figure is all around appetite regulation and some of the biological factors that go into that. So just look at all the lines here. It looks like a real spider web, and that's really what it is. It takes that previous slide I showed you and really amps it up to the next level. This is the kind of thing we're dealing with. Very complex issue. So in summary, BMI really is universally used to diagnose childhood obesity, not just in Louisiana, not just in the United States, but around the world. And it's a very common yardstick used to look at the prevalence of obesity among different populations. So it's very useful in that regard. Secondly, the prevalence of childhood obesity has increased substantially in the US and in the world over the past few decades, as was demonstrated by the graphs and the maps that I showed you, that, if you define an epidemic as either an excessive prevalence or a sudden increase in a disease, well, that word epidemic certainly fits what we're dealing with in childhood obesity. We have an excessive prevalence in the United States. 18.5 of kids have obesity, and it has increased substantially over time. So it certainly fits that definition of an epidemic. Finally, each child is an individual and has their own level of risk associated with obesity. And we need to understand these geographic and demographic disparities that we observe in the United States and what that might mean as we begin to roll out intervention programs that target all of these high-risk groups. So with that, I will leave you and thank you for your attention.
And I'm a faculty member at the School of Kinesiology here at the University of Michigan. I'm happy to be with you all today via this virtual presentation. And I also hope that everyone in the family are safe and well. The title of today's presentation is Promoting Physical Activity and Developmental Health in Children with Physical Literacy. I will discuss a little bit about physical activity, the benefits of physical activity, and some of the current statistics for children and youth. We would then move into promoting physical activity and developmental health through physical literacy, a few research findings relating to motor skills, and then finally ending with some teaching strategies that you can do in your classroom environment. Physical activity refers to the bodily movement that we produce and requires energy expenditure. This includes all forms of movement that we do in our leisure time, even transporting ourselves to places if we are an active commuter to work, types of movement that we do when we play or engage in recreational activities. According to the guidelines, preschool-aged children should be encouraged to be physically active throughout the day to support growth and development. Specifically, they should engage in 3 hours of physical activity each day and at least 15 minutes of activity each hour. Most importantly, they should not be sedentary for more than 60 consecutive minutes. For older children, ages 6 to 17, they are encouraged to engage in physical activity they are encouraged to engage in 60 minutes or more of physical activity on a daily basis. And that activity should be of moderate to vigorous intensity, referring to some type of activity that requires your heart to beat fast, you to breathe heavily, but you still are able to have a sensible conversation with individuals. There are several benefits of physical activity that are critically important to highlight. One is the physical growth and development. Physical activity strengthens a young child's heart and lungs. They help them build muscles and strengthen their bones, as well as increase their energy and improve their fitness levels, just to name a few. Physical activity also helps our psychological and emotional well-being. It encourages fun and makes children feel happy. It reduces their anxiety and aids with depression and stress. Physical activity is also critical in promoting life skills, leadership skills, and social skills. These are skills that we're going to use across our lifespan in a variety of settings, not just the school environment, but also the work environment. And lastly, from an academic standpoint, physical activity supports cognition and academics in young kids. We have found that it has helped to improve problem-solving skills and ability, their learning attention, concentration, and memory. Recent data from 2016 found that less than a quarter of individuals between the ages of 6 to 17 are meeting the physical activity guidelines of 60 minutes of physical activity per day. And this proportion is a lot less for youth who have disabling conditions. We can also see from the chart that girls participate in less physical activity than boys. Another discerning fact is that we get less active as we get older. 42% of 6 to 11-year-olds meet the daily physical activity recommendation, but as they get older, that number decreases significantly to 7.5% and 5.1%. So overall, in terms of our physical activity, we're not doing too well. Data from the US report card of 2018 supports that we are failing and getting a D-. And that has been consistent for the past few years. So how can we promote physical activity and developmental health in children? And that can happen with physical literacy. Physical literacy is a motivation, physical competence, knowledge, and understanding to value and take responsibility for engagement in physical activity in our life. We want kids to understand and be motivated to be physically active. And we want to ensure that they have the skill set to do that. We know that physical literate children move with competence and confidence in a variety of physical activities in various environments. And all of these are beneficial to the development of the whole entire individual. When we look at physical literacy, you want to think of it in concepts like language literacy and numeracy. When you're teaching a child how to read, they first learn their ABCs. Those ABCs then lead to words, and those words build onto sentences. So similar to physical literacy, they need to have a basic movement vocabulary. They need to understand what these movement skills and movement tasks are. So what is a jump? What is a hop? What does it mean to leap or gallop? Then they would like to, once they know and understand these words, know how to execute these words and movement sequences, they can then apply these skills to a movement task in more complex environment. So just like any language or any skill that we learn in any academic setting, we have to have a basic foundation for physical literacy. And that starts off with the movement vocabulary and understanding what these basic movement skills are. And examples of these skills are kicking, throwing, skating, running, swimming, dodging, and balancing. These are skills that we manipulate our hands, that we use our hands and our feet to manipulate objects. Are they skills that take us from one place to another? Or skills that help us take control of our body and keep control and balance of our body? And again, these skills are important because if an individual is unable to throw, he or she might not engage in a game of baseball, softball, soccer, or rugby. If a child is not competent or confident in their ability to swim, they will probably stray away from engaging in water sports activities and recreational activities. So we want to ensure that all individuals have a basic level of confidence and competence in these skills. So we build physical literacy by understanding the movement vocabulary. So we want individuals to have a repertoire of movement skills or a sequence of skills. We want to make sure that they are fluent in these movement behaviors, that they're able to execute a component of the movement vocabulary with some expertise. And lastly, we want to make sure that they are proficient, that they're able to select and identify what skill is needed in a situation or a movement, in a movement situation or movement environment, and then be able to apply that skill. So again, building motor movement vocabulary, movement fluency, and movement proficiency. I want you to take a moment and think back to your childhood or even your adulthood when somebody taught you something critical about movement, or you were inspired to move. We can be those individuals for young kids. A young child during those early childhood years of 0 to 6 are going to be influenced by movement and those basic competencies and motor skills from the environment of their home, their preschool, daycare, or even community and sports program. It is up to us as parents and guardians, as their child care provider or the kindergarten teacher, to really give them a solid foundation in those skills. Similarly, as they get older into those more formative years, the school continues to play an important role in the development of these skills, along with the home and the community. We now have PE teachers, classroom teachers, coaches that are helping to support making an individual a competent and confident mover. So highlighting some of the research that we have found relating to motor skills. And again, like the ABCs for language literacy, these motor skills are the ABCs for physical literacy. One of my former students, Sam Logan, conducted a study to look at what is the effect of individuals who serve as a control for an intervention study. Often as researchers, we test the effectiveness of a program by testing the treatment against individuals who do not receive a treatment, usually outdoor recess. And he found that individuals or kids who serve as a control group do not see positive changes in their motor skills prior to the start of the study and at the end of the study. This finding was critically important because it supports that fundamental motor skills are not these naturally occurring behaviors. Just like reading and writing, these are skills that must be taught, practiced, and reinforced. As a teacher, we don't expect a child to know how to do those skills until they learn those skills from our teachings. And that is the same as fundamental motor skills. We have to have these skills taught, they need to be reinforced and practiced on a daily basis. There's literature that shows across the early childhood, middle childhood, and adult years that there is a correlation between motor skills and physical activity. That correlation is low to moderate, but it does exist. We also know that there is a relationship between motor skills and physical activity over time in terms of longitudinally. So when we track the same individual in kindergarten, first, second, third, fourth, fifth grade, et cetera, individuals who are most physically active are those who are most skilled. Again, linking skill to activity and how the two are critically important. A recent finding from a few years ago supports that motor skills relate to developmental health outcomes. In addition to showing that motor skills are positively related to motor skills, motor skills are positively related to physical activity. We also found that motor skills are positively related to our physical fitness, both our cardiovascular, muscular strength and endurance, agility, and flexibility. And we also found that motor skills is inversely related to weight in terms of individuals who are more proficient in their motor skills demonstrate healthier weight outcomes and a healthier weight status. In terms of some cognitive outcomes, we also completed a study with one of my former students, Kara Palmer, that found that when kids are given two conditions, they demonstrate better attention and less errors. These are cognitive tasks on an activity. So these are individuals here who is in a sedentary group. In the clear box, those in the dark group receive a 30-minute movement and physical activity session. And those individuals who received the movement intervention, they demonstrated better scores on their cognitive attention task. They were able to focus and have less errors compared to the children on days that they received a sedentary task, which was having a story read to them. Again, supporting the importance and the notion of getting physical activity in our daily lives for young children. Here's a project that examined the effect of physical activity, of a motor skill intervention on motor skill outcomes and delayed gratification. You see here, this motor skill piece is that individuals started off at the same amount or same level in terms of their skills. And the individuals who received the intervention had significant improvements, whereas those in the control, we have seen before, do not have positive outcomes in terms of their motor performance. But what is critically important from a teaching standpoint is this delayed gratification. Individuals are given an opportunity to have, a smaller prize now or wait and have a larger prize later. And we found that at pre-test, these individuals were the same in terms of their delayed gratification, that they were able to demonstrate restraint and wait for the prize that's a little bit bigger versus getting a smaller prize because I don't have the impulse control to wait for something at a delayed time. This intervention found that over the course of the intervention, from pre to post, the kids in the CHAMP group maintained their delayed gratification, where there was a significant decline in those who served in the control group. So again, this goes back to the notion of looking at the benefits of movement and physical activity to young children. They're able to have better skills and also better cognitive outcome and self-regulation behaviors. So I'm going to end with some teaching strategies that we can do every day in our classroom to promote developmental health and physical activity. Be an active role model. and actively participate with your children in the games and activities. Often I see teachers who go out for recess and they let the children play, but engage with them and you might get your physical activity also. Display photos of children being active in your classroom, depicting different motor skills and physical activity. And the kids might ask about that and then be more motivated to engage. Limit rules that discourage physical activity. You don't reward bad behavior by taking away recess. Think of ways to make kids more active and encourage activity. Encourage and facilitate outdoor play. Integrate movement breaks into your school day or your lesson. And lastly, make physical activity a part of your daily routine. Here are some additional resources that could be beneficial to you as teachers to help get your children healthy, active, and moving in your classroom environment. And I'd like to end with the following. It is very important to note that it is a confident mover and a competent mover that would be an active mover. We want to encourage our children and ourselves as adults to be confident and demonstrate competence in our movement abilities and movement behaviors. And we would then be an active mover of physical activity and engagement across our lifespan. Thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to our questions. And here's my contact information in case you have any additional questions for me. Have a great day.
Meyers. I'm an assistant professor at Pennington Biomedical Research Center here in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And the title of my talk today is The Role of Food Insecurity in Explaining Trends in Childhood and Adult Obesity. So I would first like to start my talk by defining what food insecurity is, as well as giving you some information about how we measure food insecurity here in the US. I'll also provide some brief statistics on what food insecurity actually looks like in the US as well as locally, but I really want to spend most of my time today talking to you about food insecurity and obesity. And I'll first focus on what this relationship looks like in children by surveying most of the currently published literature. And then I'll also focus on food insecurity and obesity in adults by really highlighting and discussing some of the actual research and work that we've done here at Pennington Biomedical Research Center in this arena. So food security versus food insecurity. These are really kind of two sides of the same coin. Food security is access by all people at all times to enough food for an active, healthy life. Conversely, food insecurity exists whenever the availability of nutritionally adequate and safe foods or the ability to acquire acceptable foods in socially acceptable ways is limited or uncertain. So food insecurity really comprises both an issue of quantity and an issue of quality. It's first an issue of quantity because food insecurity really is about not having enough food to eat on a consistent basis. But it's also an issue of quality because it's really about not having enough nutritionally adequate and safe foods to eat on a consistent basis so that someone can eat an active and healthy lifestyle. Very often food insecurity is linked to compromised financial and material resources. So generally, this is something that individuals who are lower income experience. So it really is kind of an issue that's very often linked to poverty because of that. It also has a direct impact on nutrition and diet. And this is quite obvious because it really does impact what someone eats, how much they eat, and what types of food they eat. We can understand that food insecurity very often can compromise the nutrition of someone's diet and really can kind of disrupt or disturb their dietary patterns. And so because of all of this, food insecurity really has been identified as a key social determinant of health because it's one of those conditions in which a person can live or a person can experience, that really does have an effect on their health outcomes as well as their health risk. And so for my talk today, one of the health outcomes I really want to focus on is obesity. But first, how do we measure food insecurity here in the US? We measure this using a series of questions about the conditions and behaviors that characterize difficulty meeting basic food needs. And so the United States Department of Agriculture has developed the Core Food Security Module, which really is the gold standard here in the US by which we kind of measure as well as monitor food insecurity among households over time. The module is comprised of 18 items, and we can see here just a few of those 18 items are provided in the graphic to the right. They kind of address such issues as worrying about food running out, food bought did not last, could not afford balanced meal, as well as cutting the size of meals or actually skipping meals. And so among those 18 items, 3 reference the household, 7 reference adults, and 8 reference children if present within a household. The 18 items further reference the previous 12 months, but they can also be modified to reference the previous 30 days or month. And food insecurity is determined by 3 or more affirmative responses to these 18 items. So what does food insecurity look like here in the US? This map from Feeding America actually geographically plots the overall county food insecurity rates here in the US from 2019. I'll first point out that the food insecurity rate in the United States for this same year is 11.5%. But if we look at it kind of geographically across the US, we can see a number of disparities. So what I would really like to point out is that here in the South, there are a number of states that have food insecurity rates that are quite high, places such as Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. And then we can really compare that to places in the US where food insecurity rates are just a little bit lower. So we really do see some stark geographic disparities here. If we look to the right, these data are from the Census Bureau using the USDA data. And this looks at the trends and prevalence of food insecurity and very low food insecurity in US households from 2001 to 2019. The US Census Bureau releases this report every year, and you can see they've done so since 2001. And it's kind of like the premier place to see what food insecurity prevalence looks like here in the US. Excuse me. So we can see that in 2001, food insecurity was at about 11%. If we look at 2007, 2008, and 2009, we can actually see a pretty significant uptick in food insecurity prevalence. This corresponds with the Great Recession that occurred at the same time here in the US, where we actually saw a pretty significant economic downturn. Here in our country. And then in 2019, we can see that food insecurity among US households is at about 11.5%. If we focus here on Louisiana, I would like to point out the food insecurity rate is 16.1% in 2018, and this is almost 5% higher than what we see at the national level, which really indicates that food insecurity is quite a pronounced issue among our state's population. So I did mention that food insecurity is a key social determinant of health. And so what I really want to focus on today is the health outcome of obesity. And there really is quite a bit of literature and published data that shows food insecurity and obesity are quite strongly linked to one another. And this diagram here really outlines quite well why food insecurity can lead to or is associated with obesity. As I mentioned previously, food insecurity has a direct impact on diet. It can actually increase caloric intake from fats and refined carbohydrates. So these food items may actually be a little bit cheaper, easier for food insecure people to access, but we know that these are kind of poor dietary quality items. It can also decrease dietary variety as well as the intake of fruits and vegetables. So again, food insecurity can negatively impact dietary quality by decreasing the consumption of fruits and vegetables, which we know are those food items that are really necessary for a healthy diet. What's also interesting about food insecurity is that there can be episodes of food adequacy. intermixed with episodes of food shortage. During that time of food adequacy, there can actually be overconsumption, and really overconsumption of unhealthy foods, which can lead to weight gain. However, there also is episodes of food shortage, and this can lead to skipped meals and actually reduced caloric intake, which can potentially lead to weight loss. So we kind of have this cycle here of weight gain and weight loss. The added stress of actually being food insecure actually further complicates this pathway here, wherein food insecurity can ultimately lead to obesity. If we further follow the path, what I really like to point out is that because food insecurity negatively impacts health, we see increased healthcare expenditures. And the data do show us that food insecurity is associated with an extra over $1,800 in healthcare expenditures per year at the individual level. At the county level, the number of food insecure adults can account for quite a large share of variation in associated healthcare costs. That is, those counties that have a higher proportion of food insecure adults can actually have higher healthcare expenditures. So what does the literature really say about food insecurity and obesity? There was a recent meta-analysis that was published that surveyed all of the published literature looking at the relationship between food insecurity and obesity. And overall, they concluded a significant and positive association between food insecurity and greater body weight. And so this is nicely summarized in point 1 here, where we can see all of the data from those published studies that have looked at food insecurity and obesity are kind of represented by that dot. And that dot, as well as its range of data, kind of falls to the right of 0, indicating a significant and positive relationship. I would really like to further point out, if we look at number 18 here, again, all of those studies that have looked at food insecurity and obesity in adults does show a significant and positive relationship. However, if we make some comparisons between female adults and male adults, number 15 and number 16, we actually start to see some differences here. So if we look at the data for female adults, again, we see a significant and positive relationship. However, comparatively speaking, for males, the evidence is a little bit more mixed. While the dot that represents the data from published studies is to the right of 0, the range of that data does encompass or fall on the negative side as well, indicating that the relationship is just not that significant and not that positive in men. Also, I would like to point out number 19 here, when we look at all children, again, a similar relationship wherein there kind of is a significant and positive relationship between food insecurity and obesity, but because the range of the data falls to the left of 0, it's a little bit more mixed. So that's something that we should really keep in mind here when we think about food insecurity in children in the US. So again, we have data from the US Census Bureau. And this is trends in the prevalence of food insecurity in those households that do have children. So the percent of households with children, we can see that the food insecurity rate in 2001 was at 16% and a little below 14% in 2019. If we look at food insecurity among children specifically, we see that the rate was a little over 8% in 2001, and then a little over 6% in 2019. And again, this pie chart just kind of further breaks down these data in a similar way. But what we can see is that while food insecurity is not as great in children compared to adults, it still is an issue that children in the US do face. So there have been a number of systematic reviews published in recent years that really quite nicely summarize all of the published literature looking at food insecurity and obesity. So this first review here that I'll talk about looked at the relationship between food insecurity and pediatric malnutrition in the US. It looked at all individuals kind of under the age of 20 years. So infants, children, adolescents, as well as young adults. Of the 23 studies included in this systematic review, almost all, or pretty much all, examined the relationship between food insecurity and overweight and obesity. The evidence suggested mixed findings regarding this association, however. So again, while there seems to be this kind of significant and positive relationship between food insecurity and overweight and obesity in the US pediatric population, most of this really comes from large, well-designed cross-sectional studies. There was also another recent analysis or systematic review that looked at the relationship between food insecurity and early childhood physiological health outcomes. So this systematic review only focused on those studies that were focusing on children between the age of 0 and 5 years. They found 27 studies overall that did fit within this range of investigations, 16 of which investigated the relationship between food insecurity and childhood overweight and obesity. While 7 studies did not find a significant association, if you look to our pie chart here on the right, you can see that those studies in blue, or 33%, did find a significant association between food insecurity and overweight and obesity. So again, this is still lending some credence to the strong and positive association between food insecurity and obesity in kids. A more recent study that was published in 2021 looked at food insecurity and obesity in a sample of US adolescents. So children or adolescents between the age of 13 and 18 years old. So typically kind of those individuals that are in high school. This study used data from the National Health and Nutrition Survey, or the NHANES study. NHANES is nationally representative. It is population-based, and so it's kind of one of the premier sources of health and nutrition data here in the US. They pooled data from 2007 and through 2016, so quite a large sample. What they did find from their analysis is the prevalence of obesity among adolescents from food insecure households was significantly higher compared to those who lived in food secure households. So we can see here from their table that in food insecure households, the prevalence of obesity among adolescents was almost 26%. However, if you compare that to adolescents in food insecure household, the prevalence of obesity is 19.5%, so that's significantly lower. One caveat to their analysis, however, is that once they adjusted for additional factors such as race, ethnicity, sex, household income, food insecurity was no longer significantly associated with obesity. And to kind of finalize or wrap up our talk about food insecurity and obesity in kids, I really want to point out a very important systematic review that was recently published that looked at the relationship between universal free school meals. So things such as free breakfast or free lunch that are provided at schools, and how that related to a student's school meal participation rates, academic performance, diet quality. And important for us here is the relationship with food security and BMI. And so this analysis or systematic review only focused on economically developed countries. So studies from the US as well as similar countries were included. And what they identified were actually 47 studies that looked at the association between these factors here. So first, what they found was a positive association of universal free school meals with diet quality, academic performance, and food security. So what this really is showing us is that the provision of free breakfast and free lunch is associated with improvements in food security among students. That means it actually lowers food insecurity for those students. They also found several studies identified a potentially protective effect of universal free school meals on BMI. That is, again, the provision of free breakfast and free lunch within schools that was associated with lower BMIs among those students. And so this is potentially some positive news about the role that schools, and specifically the role of universal free school meals, can play in kind of protecting children from food insecurity, but also not having a negative impact on their BMI, but actually having a positive impact by reducing their BMI in providing these meals. And so the last portion of my talk will focus on food insecurity and obesity in adults. And I really want to highlight some recent research that I've undertaken here at Pennington in collaboration with Dr. Katz-Marzek, who spoke earlier. So we were really interested in understanding the national trends in food insecurity by BMI among adults in the US. So we only focused on those individuals in the US 20 years of age and older. We relied on the NHANES for this analysis because, again, it's kind of the premier source of health and nutrition survey data here in the US, and we pulled data from 1999 to 2016. And this is really the range of data that has food security measures available. And then in Haynes, the food security status is determined using the 18-item USDA module that I described earlier in my presentation. So it uses the gold standard. We looked at BMI as kind of our primary health outcome here. And we were also interested in looking at potential disparities by sex. Given what we know about what the previous literature shows us about differences in food insecurity and obesity between men and women, that was one of the primary focuses of our analysis here. So first, if we look overall at food insecurity prevalence among adults in the US, we see that in 1999, it was 8.7%, and that rose to 18.2% in 2016. But again, above and beyond kind of overall food insecurity rates, we really wanted to break the prevalence of food insecurity down by obesity. In this case, we used BMI, specifically the three categories of BMI: normal weight, overweight, and obese. If we focus on obese first, the obese category first, we can see that food insecurity prevalence among adults who were obese in 1999 was 2.4%, and that rose to 22.6% in 2016. If we further compare that 22.6% in 2016 in the obese category to what the prevalence was in the overweight and normal weight categories, we can see those two categories were a little above 15%, indicating that the prevalence of food insecurity for obese adults was significantly greater for those adults with obesity in 2016. So here I'll only present our sex data, and we can see if we break this down further by men as well as women, we can make a number of important comparisons here. So if we look at men first, kind of the general takeaway here is that food insecurity prevalence from 1999 to 2016 increased in all BMI categories without really a distinct pattern between those BMI categories for men. However, if we look at women, there's a different story kind of at play here. Food insecurity prevalence from 1999 to 2016 did increase among all BMI categories for women. But what's really striking here is that the increase in food insecurity prevalence for women with obesity is really significantly greater at all time points compared to women who have normal weight as well as women who have overweight and obesity, wherein the food insecurity prevalence in these two categories is quite similar. So again, we're kind of further telling the story about how women kind of bear the burden of the link between food insecurity and obesity. We next pulled the data together, and we wanted to understand how BMI impacted the odds of being food insecure, and then compare that between men and women. And we can see here, if we look at men first, there are no significant differences in the likelihood of being food insecure by BMI category. They're kind of all equal. However, if we look at women, and we compare those women with a BMI of 30 or greater, so women with obesity, we can see that their odds of being food insecure is much greater compared to both women with overweight and women with normal weight. Again, we're further building the body of evidence that food insecurity and obesity is really most strongly linked in adult women. Next, we also undertook an additional analysis using data from a study that was actually conducted at Pennington Biomedical by Dr. Kaczmarzyk and his team. And what this study and the subsequent analysis allowed us to do was really first look at the association between food insecurity and obesity, but it also really provided an opportunity to answer a unique question about what is the effect of food insecurity on weight loss, because this was a weight loss study. So the PROPEL trial was the Promoting Successful Weight Loss in Primary Care in Louisiana trial. And the objective of this trial was to test the effectiveness of a pragmatic, high-intensity, lifestyle-based obesity treatment program in a large sample of underserved adults with obesity over 2 years. So I really want to point out the sample here, which I think is quite unique for PROPEL, in that it's a large sample, 803 patients, with obesity, as well as the fact that most of these patients are underserved. So that is, it's a largely minority and lower income patient population, because these patients were from 18 primary care clinics across both urban and rural Louisiana. What this indicates is that the Propel patient population is really quite similar to kind of the Louisiana population. And we know that the population of Louisiana can be quite unique. And so this is why this particular analysis and our resulting data is also unique. So within Propel, the primary care clinics were randomized to one of two arms. First, it was the intensive lifestyle intervention, which was, the obesity treatment intervention that was health literacy and culturally appropriate. And then the remaining clinics were then randomized to usual care. And so this means that patients in these clinics just saw their primary care provider on a usual basis and just kind of received the usual care they would receive from their primary care provider. Within Propel, we measured food security status. We did so using a modified 6-item module, and I'll show that on my next slide. What we were first interested in is the relationship between food insecurity and BMI at baseline, so kind of at the beginning of the study. And then further, we were interested in the relationship between food insecurity and weight loss or body weight over the course of the Propel trial, which is really quite a unique question to ask, again, because it helps us to understand not only how food insecurity impacts body weight, but how can it impact the potential for change in body weight. This is the 6-item module that we used. You can see it's slightly modified from the 18-item version with some health literacy considerations kind of built into simplifying the questions, but still equivalent to the 18-item module. So first, what did we find at baseline? We found that 31% of patients were food insecure in the Propel trial. More African-American patients reported being food insecure versus being food secure. So again, we're getting at that underserved population. You can see here that if we looked at BMI between our food secure patients and our food insecure patients, we can see that the food insecure patients had a significantly higher BMI at baseline compared to their food secure counterparts. We further broke that down by comparisons between males and females, and we can see here that BMI at baseline for females who were food insecure was significantly higher than their food secure counterparts. Comparatively speaking, males did not demonstrate a similar pattern. So again, while this data is not nationally representative, it is somewhat representative of a Louisiana population. And again, we can see that women who were food insecure had greater BMI than their food secure counterparts. And again, we were really interested in understanding how food insecurity impacted weight loss in the Propel trial. So what we have here in our figure are 4 groups. We looked at food insecure individuals who received the usual care. We looked at food insecure patients who received the intensive lifestyle intervention. And then conversely, we looked at food secure patients in the usual care group, as well as food secure patients who received the intensive lifestyle intervention. We looked at their body weight in kilograms at baseline, 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, and 24 months. So we were really able to plot their weight or their weight loss across the course of the 2 years. And so one of the things that the overarching finding of this analysis is that food insecurity did significantly moderate patient responses to the Propel trial. And what we found is that relative to food secure patients, those who were food insecure and received the intensive lifestyle intervention versus usual care had smaller reductions in body weight over 24 months. That is, they lost less weight over 24 months. So if we look here at our dotted blue line, we can see that these are the patients who are food secure in the intensive lifestyle intervention, and they lost quite a bit of weight over the 24 months. If we further look at our dotted black line, this is our food insecure patients in the intensive lifestyle intervention. And again, we can see that these patients lost weight, which is really great and quite positive. but they did not lose as much weight as their food secure counterparts, which really indicates to us that while they can lose weight in an intensive lifestyle intervention, it's not equivalent to what we see in those individuals who do not have food insecurity. And the difference is almost 2.5 kilograms, so it's quite pronounced. So again, these data are really compelling in that they go beyond just the cross-sectional association between food insecurity and obesity, and really indicate that over the long term and with the attention of weight loss, food insecurity does play a quite deleterious role in body weight for adults here in the US and in Louisiana specifically. And so to wrap up my talk today, I want to just briefly highlight the role of COVID-19 and its potential, its role in increasing food insecurity, which we know most of the data has shown here in the US, but also the potential long-term implications of COVID-19 on the relationship between food insecurity and poor health outcomes. And this is because COVID-19 and the associated pandemic was not just a public health crisis, but was certainly an economic crisis or a socioeconomic crisis, whereby food insecurity was increased, quite pronounced, and we can assume that long-term this has negative implications for health outcomes, such as what we talked about today with obesity. I also want you to recall the trend lines that we looked at in our food insecurity prevalence. And we can see that food insecurity during the Great Recession was quite pronounced. While we don't have the data yet for 2020, maybe we can expect to see a similar uptick in food insecurity in our 2020 data. And then if we further look at that by BMI, we certainly are set up to answer some really interesting questions in the future about the link between food insecurity and obesity, and further considerations about how COVID-19 has really impacted that relationship. And so in conclusion, we found that food insecurity and obesity are significantly linked in adults, both from our own data as well as other data out there, and women really drive this relationship. From much of the published evidence, we can see that food insecurity and obesity in children is mixed. So why do we see this relationship in adults but not so much kids? There have been some suggestions in the published literature that say adults in food insecure households really protect children, especially younger ones, from compromised household dietary quality. One of the concepts that has been talked about is this idea of maternal deprivation, whereas mothers will sacrifice their intake so that their children will be less affected. So it's indicating that moms may forego their own meals, forego their own food to make sure that their kids eat. And then last, again, thinking about the long-term implications of how COVID-19 will potentially impact the relationship between food insecurity and obesity. And so with that, I'll stop here. I thank you for your time, and please feel free to reach out to me at my email address if you have any further questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you. All three of the speakers for a great presentation. I do have one thing to share with you before we actually begin the Q&A, and that is we would like for you to complete the evaluation for today's webinar at louisianafitkids.com by clicking on today's date on the calendar. You'll see when you click on April 21st, you'll get a pop-up that will ask you to click here to complete the evaluation for this meeting. This will help us not only evaluate today's webinar series, but to also actually plan for the next one, which I mentioned would be in September. So we do have some questions in the chat. The first question that was listed was, I'll point it out to all three of the speakers. Based on the statistics presented today, what are your suggestions to get family/household participation? Would it be sleep habits, lower TV time, better nutrition? Dr. Kaczmarzyk, would you like to begin? Oh, we're not hearing your voice. Not hearing you. Candace, would you want to unmute and say something as well?
I jump in while we're figuring out Peter's audio. I would say probably one of the most important things is, you know, find a way to get families involved. For those of you who are parents, you know, doing something as a group to promote activity, having appropriate rules and guidelines for media use and sleep habits are some of the key things that can be incorporated from a parental standpoint. From a teaching standpoint, you know, homework assignments for young kids can potentially incorporate some type of activity of, you know, getting parents to do afternoon walks or afternoon games with their child to, you know, pull them out of, you know, that their normal routine of coming home, probably watching TV or doing screen time on a media device, to doing something more outside and getting them engaged in the community and being more mobile.
Yes, I actually was wondering about the transition from when I was a child, when we played outside, to everybody now. They're on their iPhones, they're on their iPads, they're on the computer, they're, you know, is there some way to make that more active and yet let them be on there?
There could be. I know of some researchers who have, I think one is at the Pennington group, and that they have incorporated like mobile apps and devices to get individuals more physically active. I imagine there are still some that probably focus on it from a nutritional standpoint too. So I think that would be the key of making sure we can make these resources, continue to research them and, you know, find their effectiveness and then make them more readily available and accessible to individuals. And then hopefully that can be a way of promoting activity.
Dr. Kaczmarzyk, can you have audio now? Nope, no audio. Okay, well, I'm going to go on to the next question while he continues to figure out his audio problem. Candace, we have a question that says, what are some theories that explain the differences in sex, BMI, and food insecurity?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Well, one of the things that I left off with and really didn't talk about a lot in terms of the theoretical perspectives that people have discussed that potentially explain why food insecurity and obesity is kind of more strongly linked in women. And one of those has to do with the role that women play within our society and our families in general as mothers and as caregivers within households, those individuals who take care of the children, they take care of the household and have a lot of responsibility. And potentially as a result of that responsibility and that role, they're more willing or more apt to sacrifice for not only their family, but for their children specifically when they are experiencing food insecurity within their household. They're willing to give up potentially their own dietary quality or dietary intake to make sure that their kids are kind of protected against that and that their kids have enough to eat. Also, from the childhood perspective, we can see that children very often, especially lower income children, have access to food outside of the home via what is provided in schools. So very often schools can fill that void for kids who are lower income or resource constrained, wherein they can have access to at least 2 meals a day via breakfast or lunch. So that is also kind of like a buffering that kids may receive, whereas adults don't receive that because we don't receive meals primarily from where we work, or, you know, we're responsible for providing meals for ourselves. And so I really think in terms of the role that happens with women, I think or what happens with women, a lot of it has to do with their roles in society as kind of caretakers of their households and caretakers of their families.
Well, and, you know, just to add to that, I do want to reinforce the fact that we did a study in the lower Mississippi Delta, including Louisiana, Arkansas, and Mississippi. And we did it was called Foods 2000. It was a food survey of the entire Mississippi Delta of Louisiana, Arkansas, and Mississippi. And what we did find was that we did not see the level of food insecurity in children that we saw in adults. And the rationale was school lunch, meals provided in school. The one disadvantage that we had in that is that we did not do this survey in all seasons, like summer was missed. So we think we would have found something different in the summer, but nowadays I think there are summer meals programs that have eliminated that disparity as well. So anyway, there's another question in the chat, in the Q&A, saying, have y'all seen any similar interventional trials being done in children or adolescents and its effect on weight loss? I think this is pointing out to the fact that Propel was in adults and not in children. So would you want to weigh in on that, Dr. Kaczmarzyk? Do you have audio? Nope. He's the big guy, but he's having computer problems. But I think Candace can speak to the Propel trial.
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak to the Propel trial from the perspective of, the intention of the Propel trial was weight loss in adults in Louisiana. And the data that I presented specifically really was a true secondary analysis, in that food insecurity was kind of measured over the course of the study, but was in no way a focus of the study. It really was about weight loss in the primary care setting, among adults with obesity. And so in terms of I'm not as familiar with the pediatric weight loss literature. Maybe Dr. Robinson is, in terms of kind of other interventions in that population group that have actually shown positive approaches or interventions that induce kind of healthy weight loss for kids. But I mean, in terms of Propel specifically, overall, I didn't show the overall data, but the data did show there was clinically significant weight loss in those adults who received the intensive lifestyle intervention over the course of 2 years, which is really positive. And I also think it's positive that the food insecure participants lost weight as well. It's just somewhat disheartening that those individuals who were food insecure at baseline did not lose as much weight. And I think it speaks to the role that food insecurity can play in blunting weight loss or hindering weight loss efforts, because it's a complicating factor, especially as it relates to access to resources, and then being able to access a diet that would allow someone to actually lose weight over the long term, in a healthy way.
Right. Another question is, what is the panel's view on stressing the importance of quality physical education programs in schools? And I think, Dr. Robinson, that's probably right up your alley.
Yes, I can definitely address that. To be honest, I'm a firm believer in physical education. That is actually how I started out in this field, but I just began focusing more on skill development in preschool and early childhood years. But I think physical education is critical. It's going to be one of those critical humps that we need to really get a hold on to really help ensure that young children are on this healthy trajectory. Within a quality physical education program, not only do they develop these motor skills, but they learn knowledge and behaviors to be physically active and physically fit. So I became this past year with COVID, I became more concerned with what type of physical education kids are getting, since now a lot of it had to be moved to remote learning, or they have not received physical education at all in this remote environment that some kids are learning in. And I think that's something that we critically need to address from an educational standpoint, because you can't just replace, I think, physical education with physical activity breaks or physical activity sessions. That physical activity need to be a complement with the physical education programs. So I think that's something that, you know, as a society and various educational systems got to really get back to, you know, providing high quality physical education programs like we do with literacy programs and math programs in public schools.
Gotcha. I guess Dr. Kaczmarzyk is MIA right here. He could have joined you, Candace, because your audio is working. Tell him to come on down. So here's another question. Any thoughts, theories, or research on an alternative health measure to BMI? This is right up Dr. Kaczmarzyk's alley. Candace, maybe you can run out and see if he's available and go into your office.
I'll let Dr. Robinson take that one because I'm sure she has better perspective on it. But I will say, just from like a health disparities perspective about the BMI, there has been some discussion about the inadequacies of body mass index and how we calculate it in relationship to certain races and ethnicities, both from like a biological standpoint as well as a cultural standpoint, that it may not capture everything that really speaks to, you know, healthy body weight, especially for certain population subgroups.
Yes, I definitely agree. This is a great answer for Peter. But as Candace mentioned, BMI has been, you know, under more scrutiny of is that the best measure. I know in my lab, we are doing now more with waist circumference and looking at hip to weight ratio to really see other indicators of body fat and body size or body mass that would be more indicative in terms of indicators of health status in young kids, because there are critical factors of body mass that body mass index does not capture in young kids. And Peter, I think he's here. He might can add something in.
So Peter, the question was, are there any thoughts, theories, or research for an alternative health measure to BMI?
Yeah, well, certainly, as Leah mentioned, we use waist circumference quite a bit nowadays, and people are always deriving new indices to be used in children. Largely from a health perspective, BMI does a pretty good job. You know, BMI and waist circumference are very highly correlated, and it's only in cases where you might have to be working with child athletes who have a, you know, larger muscle mass than average, where it may be a little misplaced. But in general, children with a BMI over the 95th percentile or above, you know, the 97th, you know, they generally have excess adiposity. Of course, as Leah mentioned, you know, when you see the child in a clinical setting, you can definitely tease that apart fairly easily.
Okay, well, here's another question. Is there an impact on where the meals, excuse me, is there an impact on where the meals come from or the source of foods and the occurrence of obesity?
Is that in relationship like the meal provided at home versus the meal provided in a school setting, or?
Well, I'm actually not quite sure what they're getting to, but actually I remember many years ago, one of our medical doctors here, Dr. Donna Ryan, was posed when Louisiana was had the highest obesity rates in the United States. She was interviewed and asked, well, you know, what do you account for this? And she said, well, McDonald's or any fast food is cheaper than fruits and vegetables. And so I always, you know, think back to that comment about cheap, you know, high fat snack foods or fast foods. And, you know, the fact that perhaps, you know, it's really a food insecurity. It's an economic issue. And so to me, that's why I think that we're seeing in terms of children, the importance of school lunch, and not only school lunch, but they can have school lunch, they can have school breakfast, and they can have a snack. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I think this is a marvelous answer to the food insecurity problem. And hopefully, because the USDA actually has regulations about the meals, they are healthy and they're better for you. So better for our children anyway. I like to eat school lunch if I go to school too. So because I know I'm getting a good and balanced meal.
No, absolutely. I agree with that. Certainly in a food insecure household, the data show that the quality of the diet is not healthy. And one of the other pathways that food insecurity impacts diet or nutritional intake is through disrupted eating patterns. If we take like the typical example of 3 square meals a day and then 2 snacks, a food insecure household may not have the opportunity to follow that kind of typical eating pattern on a daily basis. And then if we think about it across the course of a month, if you have a family that's food insecure who's also receiving some form of food assistance, let's say they're receiving SNAP, which is what we call food stamps. If they're receiving SNAP, very often they receive that reimbursement at the beginning of a month, so they're able to afford food at that point in time. However, towards the end of the month, once they've utilized that, they may not have as good of access to food, certainly to healthier food options. And so at the end of the month, their food eating or their food patterns in terms of what their intake patterns may be not healthy, in terms of kind of maybe you're even binging 1 meal a day and then foregoing for the rest of the day because you just can't afford another meal. And so we know that type of eating pattern is not a healthy eating pattern.
Right. So Dr. Kaczmarzyk, I have another question here that is concerning to me, and that is when I look at the rates of childhood obesity, for children ages 2 to 4 that are participating in WIC, the obesity rate is 13.2%. As they grow into the older age groups, 10 to 17, the obesity rate increases to 20.1%. But for high school students in particular, which comprise part of this, the larger age group, the obesity rate drops 16 to 16.5%. So what happens between the ages of the middle school ages compared to the high school students to account for that decrease in obesity rates? Because we're number 14 actually in high school students.
Mm-hmm.
That's a good question. Maybe what you're referring to in the high school ages, we rely on the youth risk behavior surveillance system to assess obesity in these children. And those are largely self-reported heights and weights.
Oh.
And so you see that when people report their weights, they tend to underreport them. And so we see this difference between the measured level of obesity versus the self-reported. So it's not that the obesity rates are going down, there's a difference in the methods used between these different age groups. For example, the data that I showed with NHANES, that was all directly measured height data. And you don't see that trend that you're describing.
Yeah, I just happened to see this in a website that says stateofobesity.org, stateofchildhoodobesity.org. So Dr. Kaczmarzyk, do you anticipate that if, I know that we no longer have our childhood obesity, big meetings that we used to have once a year. And hopefully this venue will take the place of that in large part. I'm curious as to, do you think, based on the report card for childhood obesity that we published many years ago, that things are the same, better, worse? I'd like your take on that.
Yeah, if you look at the data, we saw evidence a few years ago that the prevalence of obesity appeared to be plateauing in children a little bit.
Yes.
And CDC made a big deal about that. But actually now there's another uptick, that it's actually gone up again. So it's kind of dangerous to try to predict these trends with just the data for a couple of years, because there is fluctuations and it bounces around a little bit. So looking at the long-term trends, we see that obesity rates continue to increase in all age groups and children, and there's no evidence of a plateau. So if we use that for any kind of prediction, we would say that, you know, it's just going to continue to increase over time in the absence of any intervention. You know, if we can get some movement in public health and actually address this issue, then we'll see some turnaround, I hope.
So do we think that COVID-19 has played a part in this this increase, at least over the last year?
Yeah, maybe Leah could talk to that in terms of the physical activity perspective, because I think she knows all about that. But certainly from the perspective, we have seen a jump, I think, in prevalence of obesity.
Yeah, we're starting to see some initial data come out of that has explored kids during COVID, you know, what happened now and showing now post-COVID. And I imagine, you know, it's showing that there is an increase in more weight gain and also that they are less active. So I think we don't really know the full effect of this past year. And in some places, you know, kids are still not in school, like here in Ann Arbor, in Michigan. So I think, you know, probably a year from now, we really are going to see what are some of the effects of, you know, being, you know, in isolation and not in schools, not in youth sports for this past year or more in our children's health.
Well, I know for sure that when I'm at home working virtually, the pantry is very close by. And I'm wondering, you know, if maybe just out of boredom or not having enough to do, if maybe there's some relationship where that's concerned.
Mm-hmm.
And there's another question in the chat, in the Q&A. What can public health do to help the obesity situation? So that's talking to our public health departments, Louisiana Department of Health, other departments of health throughout the United States. Mm-hmm. Got a feeling about that answer to that question?
I will, you know, start, and hopefully Candace and Peter can jump in. I think one, we have to really declare, you know, obesity a public health concern, and, you know, similar to what we have this past year with COVID, that this is something that we can't just keep pushing under the rug. It's costing our healthcare system money, the health of not only adults, but, you know, kids as they get older. So it's something that, you know, we need more federal policies and guidelines to really be put in place that are more universal, of, you know, school physical education programs, school recess programs, community programs. So I think we just, as a nation, we just got to really say that this is another health crisis that needs to be addressed, like we have addressed other health crises.
Any further comment from Candace or Peter?
Well, I mean, I think really the data from Propel, though, has some implications for, you know, at least the treatment of obesity as an actual chronic disease or a public health issue. Mm-hmm. What's done in primary care settings. So it could potentially be a strategy that could be adopted, you know, in clinical settings and utilized in that way, wherein the treatment of, you know, lowering someone's body weight in a healthy way is actually built into kind of their usual care, and finding a way to manage that the way you would manage almost any other chronic disease, especially because we know obesity is not a disease that isn't linked to other things. It is linked to things like chronic to cardiovascular health. It is linked to things like diabetes. And so with that in mind, kind of treating it as part in a similar fashion that we would treat someone who has diabetes or someone who has poor cardiovascular health, taking like a multifaceted approach to it and not treating these issues in isolation, but really kind of treating the whole person holistically. I think that could, you know, offer some potential positive implications for addressing obesity.
So Peter, can you weigh in specifically on what public health could do to help the obesity situation, particularly in children?
You know, I think we use the term public health very broadly. And it's like Leah mentioned, I believe we need to involve all the major institutions where our children interact. For example, in the schools, as she mentioned, putting physical activity back into the schools. The pediatricians need to be on board and be willing to talk about obesity with parents. Parents need to be on board to actually try to change behavior. And, you know, all the way down the line. So as I showed that diagram of the complexity of the obesity problem, you know, just moving one lever in that isn't going to do a whole lot. We need a concerted effort, collaboration among the schools, the pediatricians, the parents. Everyone needs to be involved. It's truly public health. It's everyone.
Okay. Yeah. And jumping back on Peter, I think the model he showed at the end of his presentation about all of the sectors within our society that influence obesity prevention is, you know, those are the entities that we all need to, you know, come to play.
And also, one of our attendees says she would love to connect with you in regards to reviving the Pediatric Obesity Initiative in Louisiana. She's a pediatrician, board certified in pediatric obesity, and I think we might want to reach out and touch her to connect with her to make that happen.
Absolutely.
One other person asked, do we know what the Obesity Council does? I just think Obesity Council even as active as it used to be?
There's been several iterations of the Obesity Council in Louisiana. And the last one was called the Obesity, it wasn't Council, it was Obesity something. But it's merged now with the diabetes group. So it's now the Diabetes and Obesity
Initiative.
Commission, yes, yeah. It went from the Obesity Council to the Obesity Commission. Now it's merged with the diabetes group. So it's the Diabetes and Obesity Commission.
Oh.
And they continue to meet. Definitely, it's spearheaded by LDH, and they continue to meet.
I know that we used to have a pediatric obesity group here that met. I was part of it, you were too, but that hadn't met in a long time. And do you think this Obesity Diabetes Commission is under the Well Ahead project, as somebody asked?
That's part of it. That's yeah, Well Ahead is a component of it, for sure.
Oh, okay.
The commission itself, you know, they meet, I don't know whether it's once a month or once a quarter, but they continue to be very active.
All right. Well, those are all the questions that we have. So I'm sure that most people wouldn't mind having about 7 minutes extra time to just do what you want to do. Please remember to complete the evaluation. It's very important. And this is one way that we're going to plan for a really great webinar in September. We have not yet decided on the date, but we will be doing that shortly. Any tips, even under that, would be helpful. And one other person said, yes, Well Ahead oversees the commission. So we have some people who know what's going on here.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you to all of our presenters. I think you did a great job despite some technical difficulties on your end. Dr. Katz-Marzik will have to get the IT people to look at your computer to figure out what's wrong, because next time we don't want this to happen. Of course, maybe you won't be presenting next time. Maybe you'll just be one of the panelists. Well, thanks to all and have a wonderful rest of your day.
All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.